let's talk just a little bit about the economic relationship of the English colonial system to the mother country and what kind of an influence that had on recreational patterns and even available recreational goods in the colonies. The political and economic purpose of these colonies was to make money for the mother country. And the way England and the other major European powers understood that, the way they thought colonies worked, the way they thought colonies functioned to make the mother country wealthy, was an idea called mercantilism. The early modern Europeans believed that a country profited from trade by capturing as much of the available trade for themselves and for their own European colonial system and capturing it away from competing systems. So, for example, the way the English believed the English profited from the slave trade was to capture as much of the slave trade as possible for themselves as against the Dutch or the Spanish or the Portuguese. This is a different idea about how wealth is generated from what you would be taught today. Today, an economist would argue that freer trade lifts all boats and that the way countries become wealthy from trade is by trading as freely and openly as possible. In the 1600s and 1700s, the major European powers thought of trade as largely a zero-sum game and as a pie they tried to capture the largest possible slice of. To speak in slightly more direct economic terms, they thought about this in terms of flow of specie. They wanted the money, gold and silver. They wanted as much of that to wind up in London as possible. If, for example, you bought something from Spain, the gold winds up in Madrid. So you want to buy from the English colonial system. This had consequences for how the English and how the other major European powers regulated trade between the mother country and the colonies. And the English, in particular, passed a series of laws trying to keep as much of the trade within the within the English colonial system as possible. And the way this wound up working in the Atlantic world was an idea usually referred to as triangular trade. That the general pattern of trade was that manufactured goods in Europe were traded in Africa for slave labor. And in particular, the valued goods were guns, metal goods, knives, pots, things of this nature. And that labor was used to grow raw materials in the New World, commodities. And the big money was in sugar in the Caribbean and in Brazil. But they also grew other commodities, the coffee, chocolate, tobacco, and a variety of others. And then the profits from the sale of the raw materials, the sale of the commodity, returned to the mother country, and round and round and round it went. One of the consequences of this is that there were a variety of economic and regulatory forces that caused the North American English colonies to be relatively low in manufactured goods. The English wanted the manufacturing to be done in England, and they thought of North American colonies as consumers of manufactured goods rather than a place that a lot of manufacturing should take place. One consequence of this, and in one of the articles that you will read in this module, the historian Nancy Struna will talk a little bit about this. As a historian, Nancy Struna looked for evidence of what kind of recreation was taking place in the colonies by looking for goods devoted specifically to recreation. When you find wills, when you find estates, do you find evidence that colonial households had goods devoted to play, fowling pistols, card tables, the bats? And one of the things that Struna finds is that it was relatively late in the colonial period before those things began to be common. She notes that you begin to see a significant number of these things turning up in colonial households somewhere in the mid to late 1700s. But before that, even once many of these colonies were relatively economically and sociologically stable. They remained relatively bereft of those kinds of recreational consumer goods until a little bit farther down the road. And the system of triangular trade and the way in which England regulated this mercantile world is a partial explanation for the relative level of consumer goods that a historian like Nancy Struna was able to find in the colonial period. And of course, the much larger implication of triangular trade, which it's important to remember, is that the wealth of these colonies was built overwhelmingly on slave labor. And because we're interested primarily in the North American colonies that eventually become the United States, it slightly disguises the impact of that, because the big money and the primary focus of economic regulation for the European mercantile powers was the world of sugar in the Caribbean. And while tobacco and other North American products, particularly agricultural products in the middle colonies and northern colonies, while they were important, that wasn't where the real big money was. And since we are interested in the relationship between attitudes about recreation and attitudes about work and labor and the legitimacy of labor, it's important to remember that a great deal of the wealth generated by the European colonial enterprise was generated on the back of unfree labor that had been purchased in Africa as a part of this system of triangular trade. And this too will have implications in the 19th century for attitudes about the legitimacy of work and certain kinds of recreation as we move forward.